For 3 years now, I have come in search of fruit on this fig tree, but have found none. For 3 weeks now, we have been in Lent. Have we borne fruit? The answer to that question determines everything. Think about it. Why does Jesus choose to say 3 years for this parable? Well, that was the same amount of time that he spends in his public ministry on earth. In other places in the gospel, Jesus makes a comparison between a fig tree and the chosen people, Israel. God the Father is the owner of this orchard, and Jesus is the gardener. We see this, that he's captured in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's buried in a garden. Mary Magdalene, when she first sees him after the resurrection, thinks he is the gardener. And just as Adam was set in the garden to tend it at the beginning, so Jesus, the new Adam, is set in the garden of this world to tend it as a gardener. And now this gardener, Jesus, has tended the orchard of the Israelites for 3 years. But they have borne no fruit. So many of the Jews reject him, especially their leaders. God the Father is prepared to strike them down, but Jesus, the gardener, makes a final plea. Let me cultivate and fertilize it to give it a final chance. And how do you think he does that? Where does Jesus dig in the ground? What does he place in the ground in order to fertilize? The only thing dug for him is a tomb, and in it he places his sacred body to fertilize the fig tree that is God's chosen people. Which is what brings us to today's dire warnings. Now we are the fig tree, fertilized by the death of Jesus Christ. We are quite literally nourished by the body and blood placed within us in Holy Communion. That's the context for what St. Paul writes to the Corinthians and to us. He points out this: just as our ancestors were baptized into Moses, so we are baptized into Christ. Moses fed the people with spiritual bread and drink, the manna and the water from the rock. Jesus feeds us with the spiritual food and drink of the Eucharist. And despite all of this, the followers of Moses are struck down in the desert for their sins because they bore no fruit. Simply being baptized and just receiving communion is not enough. These things happened as examples for us. The Old Testament is both history and warning. Jesus gives his own version of this with the Tower of Siloam and the slaughtered Galileans, two real historical events that are warnings to us. And Jesus tells us, I tell you, if you do not repent, you will all perish as they did. And yet there is a tension here, because Jesus did warn his followers not to think that the victims of these events were more guilty than anyone else in Jerusalem. This is because rather than learning to repent from these events, people looked at them and said, oh, those people must have been terrible sinners to die like that. Because I didn't die like that, I must be fine. Sin causes suffering, illness, and death. Yet not all suffering, illness, and death comes from a specific sin. Sometimes Jesus heals people and warns them that sinning again will make them sick again. Other times he's asked, who sinned to cause this illness? And he says, there is no sin. In a general sense, all suffering and death is a punishment for sin. In a general sense, we all deserve suffering and death for sin. But this does not mean that we can judge an individual based on how much they do or do not suffer. Because the exact connections between a specific sin and a particular suffering are beyond our abilities to see in most cases. They belong to the mystery of God's plan. There is no such thing as karma. That's a demonic lie to turn us away from reliance on God. Karma makes us think we can judge people by their circumstances. They got what they deserved. Karma tricks us into thinking that we don't have to work for justice because the universe will do it for us. Karma is not real. But God is. I am who am. And he has told us that we cannot judge a soul because they suffered some terrible evil and died. He has told us that we will be judged in the end. He's told us how we will be judged: by the fruit we bear. As with the Israelites in the desert with Moses, as with the Jews of Jesus' day, simply belonging to the right group of people is not enough. Baptism is not enough. Communion is not enough. We must do these things. They are necessary. But we can fail to benefit from them if we do what those who came before us did. And what did they do? What prevents us from being saved by baptism and communion? And even though we don't see all the examples in this particular passage, St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians does give crucial examples. And the one we see here, grumbling. Moses leads the entire nation of Israel out of Egypt by miracles of God. But all of those people, except two, die in the desert before they get to the promised land. Why? Because they grumbled. They complained about God. They complained about Moses. Our church is full of corrupt people. We can and should hold such people accountable when it is in our power. But the reality is that God's authority is at work even in sinful people. Jesus told his followers to obey the Pharisees, the very people he condemned the most for their sins. Work for justice. Protect the weak, yes. But do not complain and grumble and foment division in the church just because, or you will risk being kept out of the promised land like those before. The other sins that Paul focuses in on in his letter are sexual immorality and idolatry, something we human beings have always struggled with. What is on your phone and computer? What do you count as entertainment? And when it comes to idolatry, how do you spend your Sunday outside of Mass? When you wake up, when you go to bed, and throughout the day, every day of the week, what is most important to you? Just because you show up to Mass to get communion doesn't mean you aren't also worshiping other things than God during the week. After 40 years in the desert with Moses, a whole generation died in their sins despite the food and drink they received from God. 40 years after Jesus died and rose from the dead to fertilize Jerusalem and its people, the city was torn down and left desolate for centuries, despite being the site of our salvation. After 40 days of almsgiving, prayer, and fasting, will it be clear to us and to others why Jesus died for us? So that we could live like the rest of the world in comfort and selfishness and greed and vanity? Or so that we could bear fruit in the virtues of chastity, generosity, patience, piety, fruit in turning away from sin, fruit in detachment from worldly things, fruit in caring for the least among us, fruit in bringing other souls to God in our holy Catholic faith. Either we bear fruit of some kind, or we are cut down. It's only by his grace and mercy that makes that choice even possible. But it is still a choice that must be made. And the only one who can make it is you.